All right. Hello. Salam. Welcome. I'm Adnan Husain, professor of medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world history. Welcome to my show. We've got a really special episode because there have been a lot of very important recent events that I wanted to talk about. And I have as a guest my producer, Sina Rahmani from UR or at UR.
You're Orientalist. You are Orientalist.
And host of East as a podcast. Welcome, Sina.
Thank you, Adnan. I'm happy to be here. Congratulations on launching your own channel. Seasoned podcaster though you are. You've been podcasting how many years?
Yeah, 3-4 years. And I had a radio show a long time ago on a campus radio station that was called it was called Radio Bandung, and it was about third world global history, and I kind of carried that over into guerrilla history. And now with this new channel, trying to do a variety of things from history, global affairs, Middle East politics, religion, intellectual culture, all those things. But right now, there's a very pressing topic that we want to be discussing together, which is the ceasefire that has been called in Gaza. We don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know exactly whether it will be something like the ceasefire that was declared in southern Lebanon, which was violated immediately. But in assessing our responses and reactions to it, it's clear that it is a defeat for Israel in various ways. A lot of the terms and conditions, the principles upon which the ceasefire has been agreed are the terms and conditions that Hamas established from the very outset. You might say from December 2023, what were the principles on which it would accept a negotiated settlement, which is withdrawal of all Israeli troops from the territory of the Gaza Strip, a process for successive exchange of prisoners, the so-called hostages, the captives taken, and the Palestinian prisoners. And we've already seen remarkable scenes of the return of a number of Palestinians released from Israeli jails and detention centers where they've been humiliated, physically and sexually abused, and mistreated under conditions of torture. And we've seen the return of 3 female Israeli soldiers, I might add, looking fairly healthy, receiving gift bags, and being returned to their families. So that's another provision that was established. And you might say the final provision is that Hamas continues to be the governing authority in the Gaza Strip. And so all of the explicit or stated military objectives Israel announced at the beginning, have been given up, basically, in order to secure ceasefire, however temporary it may be. And so naturally, this has caused a lot of rejoicing, relief after extreme adversity. I characterized it in a Substack post. People can read it. AdnanAHusain.substack.com, where I likened it to a Eid holiday, a religious festival, because this is the way in which people were experiencing it in Gaza, all across Palestine. There are videos showing people in Jerusalem celebrating on the Al-Aqsa, in the vicinity of the Al-Aqsa complex, with the beautiful Qubbat al-Sakhra, the Dome of the Rock, in the background, distributing sweets and really being festive and celebrating what they regard as a victory. Of course, this is a victory that came at enormous and incredible cost, but it's a victory nonetheless that people are celebrating in Palestine. And so, Sina, I just wanted to get your initial reactions to the announcement, and then we can talk a little bit more about the consequences and how to really think about this moment.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of different kind of bullet points, or I guess tiers of this conversation that we need to have. Obviously, one of the more pressing ones, the ones at least in the sense of discursively, that who won, right? You have to. I mean, you said that okay, Hamas clearly defeated Israel, and we can like measure that out. But there are a lot of Zionists and a lot of imperialists, and who are saying like ha ha ha, like oh, what is your? That's what victory looks like. I would hate to see what loss looks like for you, like as if implying that because of the ruinous state of the Gaza Strip and the relatively intact, although we don't see the damage because Zionists hide the damage, and the relatively intact nature of the Israeli Zionist project. You look at that and you think, oh, this is not even a question, right? We saw one side took a very much darker and more brutal beating than the other, right? And that is for a lot of people, that is something that perturbs them. They said, how can you call this a victory? Like hundreds, possibly over 100,000 dead. We still don't know them. Possibly never will, in terms of the exact number. I mean, I have faith in the Gaza um, health ministry, but at the same time, I mean, we're talking about bodies that evaporated. We're talking about immense amount of violence. God knows what like mass graves they're going to dig up. I mean, this was an actual Holocaust. And so there is that debate. But then there's another thing even closer to the surface is what does this actually ceasefire mean? Because the last time you and I had one of these, well, the one that was published at least, was right in the early days of the sort of rekindling of the Syria dirty war. Not that it was ever snuffed out, but the reigniting of the Syria as a front, which was one day after the Lebanese ceasefire. And that was kind of one of the thesis that we had during that ceasefire, at least what I was saying, which is this is a fake ceasefire. They're going to keep, this is a retreat that is covered up in the language of a ceasefire, but they're going to keep doing at least some of what they were doing. Right. And so,
At least the aerial bombardment,
well, yes, but there's still,
which doesn't
exactly.
have
Right.
costs
Which is,
militarily.
yeah, exactly. Which is actually the Zionist way of war, right? Which is like the main advantage they have. That clearly that they have an enormous amount of leverage over their enemy with their air power. So these are inset questions on this like same thing of like how do we react, and then on top of that there's the different question of like what do you do with what we just saw, because the getting into the weeds of like this question of like who won and what do we say, like then you get into this situation where the violent march of time continues, and the incredible story of the last 15 months will just become like a something of the past that we like relate to. But we need to sort of I feel like we need to get our bearings and understand that a besieged orphan army, starved and brutalized by years of like smaller skirmishes, that whose enemy enjoys every kind of technical and intelligence, satellite controls every bit of airspace, right? That this situation resulted in a failure of the Israelis to reach their stated goals. Okay, because that's one way we can measure it. And I think that's what you were saying at the beginning, is that like the standard way of talking about wars is okay, what did the sides want? And who got what they want? And who did get what they want? And the side that got more of what they want wins, right? Like in this calculus. There is a question to ask about winning, losing, this kind of thing, because like, do we have the language of like sports and competition to something as like earth shattering as war? But we do. I mean, we this is how people talk, and we think in terms of conflicts and victors and losers. So I think I agree with you at one tier of this. Israel and the Zionist colonial army failed, and with their American and European handlers and enablers, and patrons, that they clearly failed in their objective to dismantle Hamas resistance, retrieve their captives, and push Palestinians out of the north. If they would have liked to push them all out,
Yeah.
but they failed in their new objective that they moved, because the first goal was to kick them all out
Into the Sinai.
into the Sinai, right? When that failed, then they moved the goalpost. They said, okay, we're going to take North Gaza, right? And then they built all their Netzarim corridors. They built their fingers. They had the pier that came before it. There was all this artifice. So then there was this pretense of victory, which was, you looking back now, a psychological operation, a psyop, to convince their own people that, oh yeah, we're doing great. This is going real well. But in reality, as we just saw, they were unable to match their expectations, to achieve their stated goals. So that in and of itself is a defeat for Israel. Israel cannot, if you have all the power on your side, like the war power, and you still can't get your enemy to do what you want them to do, there is a problem you have to confront. This desire to project their will onto this besieged enclave failed. And that's like a huge, huge thing that I think will be with us. And I think the legacy of Al Aqsa flood is that, that Palestinian guerrillas launched a massive attack using weaponry that they themselves built, right? Without the help of outside actors, because they are so besieged. Maybe some, I don't know how much, to what degree, but ultimately the scale, it's clear that the Palestinian military resistance has achieved a kind of self-sufficiency that doesn't require constant replenishment of supplies, that they can do that.
Well, that's certainly the case, that they have been able to manufacture some of their own arms and weapons, but the resupply that they've received is the incredible amount of bombardment that Israel has subjected Gaza to. And there's a certain percentage,
5% dud rate, yeah.
that is a dud rate, and which can be, explosives that can be recovered and repurposed into new weapons. And because they have carpet bombed all of Gaza with, something like
6 nuclear bombs of tonnage.
It's an incredible amount, a higher rate of devastation and intensity of bombardment than any since World War II. They have basically resupplied forces of resistance for generations with unexploded ordnance. So that's another component of it, is that the very brutality, and this is perhaps a metaphor for the entire situation, is that the very brutality of the occupation, invasion, and genocidal assault upon Gaza is what engenders its resistance and prevents any real, genuine military victory. And of course, we have to remember that all of this 15 plus months of genocide and attack upon Gaza that has leveled it, maybe something like above 60 or 70% of all structures.
80% of all structure, 92% of homes.
92% of homes, and almost like 100% in like parts of northern Gaza. Like it's just absolutely flattened. Is that October 7th, this is all a response to a military defeat. Massive military defeat, where for a day, more than a day, Israel had no control over large parts of the southern part of 1948. And this was the first time any of that territory had ever been taken and subjected to non-Israeli military control. The Gaza division was totally overwhelmed. The surveillance units were liquidated, major captives. And this has not even been documented very precisely in most of the media accounts of who were some of the military hostages, in terms of characterizing and portraying the high-level commanders who were simply overwhelmed and taken captive. So that is a huge military defeat. It forced and caused immediate responses from Israel's sponsors. There were U.S. generals sent to help coordinate operations in response, because they were really suffering a major defeat. And so when we think of what has been achieved by the resistance, which is to survive. If you're an anti-colonial resistance movement, to survive is a victory. Is that they managed in this context to survive and thus be victorious against not just the Israeli army and military that has clearly run aground, which is why the ceasefire in Lebanon happened. They were not able to take the number of casualties they were receiving, the expense, the difficulties in reconstituting units after their rotation. People were not coming back from their reserve, into their reserve units. They needed the help of the United States, Britain, doing all kinds of surveillance, overflights, supply from their bases in Cyprus. Basically, we're talking about a resistance that took on what the entire imperial West could throw at it. That is a victory from that perspective. To be able to survive that, it's quite astonishing. So from that perspective, it started with a major defeat of Israel. They had to be bailed out by the imperial West as a collective, as a whole, and even doing so after 15 plus months of unremitting attack and assault. The resistance in Gaza managed to survive and continue even to the last days and hours, and in fact, even raised the intensity in the 2 weeks prior to the ceasefire of, attacks and, operations that inflicted very serious casualties. And so I think that's really a testimony to what the resistance has managed to achieve.
I mean, think you put yourself in the shoes of like a Zionist colonist, okay? You live in a advanced Western state. Your country is ranked higher than most places on the planet in terms of development, probably, right? Your economy is high tech. you know you have an advanced agricultural sector. You connected to all ports in the West. You can fly in and out. You have airplanes that drop in and out, right? Like, the world is oriented towards your easy comings and goings from occupied Palestine. No problem. That changed on October 7th. October 7th proved that the indigenous resistance of the region could fundamentally turn the lives of Zionist colonizers on their heads. So that at the end of the day, it was Hezbollah who gave permission to the Zionist entity to allow their own settlers to come back. And that, for them, is a dark reality. That at the end of the day, even with all of their nuclear weapons, with all of with every advantage they enjoy in this war over their enemies, that at the end of the day they can't even live where they want. And this is something that people do not understand when they look at the devastation in Lebanon, and they look at, well, they don't show the devastation in northern Palestine because that's what Zionists do. But this is something that, to run them out of their own country, this is something that proves to them that they are not the supreme force. And this is a deep, deep psychological trauma to the Zionist project, that you simply cannot overwhelm and overpower and step on your enemies. I mean, look at 82 Beirut. They stormed, they got to Beirut, and yeah, like, that's it, right? Whereas now they spend weeks trying to get in. They couldn't make more than a few kilometers because some farmers and farmers' sons with limited weaponry, that's like guerrilla warfare, fought them back. And a lot of them died defending it, including the spiritual leader whose death was punishment, right? And so partly what I've been saying this whole time is that genocide is punishment for defeat, for a strategic military defeat. Because it was over on October 7th, because there was no way they could go into the tunnels and get their people back. Why? Because that's a situation where the cure is worse than the disease. They lose more people and they get more captives trying to get Joe Shlomo and like Avi KKK Lewis or whatever. Like there's no point losing people to get people. Then you're in a situation. So what could they do? What's the only thing they could do? Either negotiate and admit that you've been checkmated, or do the worst crime you can commit in history, in humanity, and do it for 15 months. I mean, announce to the world how evil you are, how mustache twirling scum your people are, how every one of them blooms a fucking Joseph Goebbels like a Pikachu, like just growing 6 feet tall, right? That you just have to, like, this is the Zionist project. So that for me, I feel that beyond like the victories and loss, right, beyond like the calculus of winner and loser, right, like that to me is like there are historical forces that act. And when you give yourself away, and now mind you, Zionists have given themselves away the whole time, it hasn't changed. So like it's and the fact that they needed an army of media goons to squish any kind of discussion, like honest discussion about what's happening, is another sign that like they're losing control over the ability to frame all of this. They're losing control, not just that, but also losing control over the geopolitical contours, right? That like they couldn't have lasted a week without their Western patrons. That the Yemeni Ansar Allah, which have themselves suffered an actually more brutal war than Gaza suffered. Now, mind you, it was spread out over the course of what, 2003 to 2015 to 2023, 22 roughly.
Almost.
Yeah, almost a decade, right? Like 8 years. And they themselves had to suffer through this genocide, destruction of all forms of life, attacking farms, living facilities, hospitals, like, but things that, and under siege, and no one, and they didn't have a fraction of the media solidarity that Palestinians have, mind you. So it didn't penetrate very much, right? Like it was just a couple of shows, yours, mine, a few other shows that actually talked about Yemen in a real way and as a real place and talked about it. And I mean, I remember those days. It was like a crazy time. And then something like 2019 Abqaiq attack happens where they attack the Aramco, and it's a game changer. And that tells them that we cannot, if we want to continue warring with these people, we are going to take painful blows. And so that began a process of, and so the painful blow of the Israelis is not from Palestinian missiles directly, right? It's not a Yemeni situation, right? Yemenis had the power to hit oil production. Palestinians obviously don't have that kind of firepower, partly because they're not allowed to develop, that they are so besieged, which is what keeps them so besieged. But on top of that, you can't inflict, you'll never be able to inflict the pain that they inflict on you. But war isn't about the infliction of pain, right? It's not about who inflicts more pain. It's about
Politics by other means.
well, it's also like who can absorb more pain, right? Who can stand there and take more pain? It's like the Rocky thing.
Well, or we don't have to go with Rocky. We can just say the rumble in the jungle.
Like, oh, exactly. That's true. Yeah, the rope a dope. Exactly. So, like, this is part of the understanding the strategy of Palestinian resistance is riding an asymmetric military force will have to ride out the genocide. Turns out what turned out to be the genocidal response of the aggressor, of the more powerful nation, which is not just a unique story to Gaza, right? Like, this was the story of the fucking Korean War. The US destroyed 80% of the country, of the buildings. And look, 80 years later, DPRK can nuke Washington. They can nuke New York, right? Like that is not a victory. Like that was not a victory. If you looked at that situation in 56 or something when it ended, I can't remember. I remember it was like, yeah, that like if you looked at the situation, you'd be like, wow, they really got it bad. Like they really, really got it bad. But look at, if they really lost that war, why is it that America is afraid of the DPRK? Like what did it mean? And in reality, if you look at the actual DPRK, the War of Korea, is that it's about America stopping the Northern victory, which essentially like they had control basically of the entirety of Korea, and America had to step in with its Western allies to then reverse the communist gains, and that's how you get modern so-called South Korea. Right. And so like what did they have to do? They had to occupy part of the Korean fucking peninsula. They had to occupy it. Like that's the extent to which America had to go to secure its victory. And we just think of Korea as this like, oh, this magical place of Samsung and LG. It's like it's an occupied island. It's occupied by the U.S. It's run as like a corporate hub of like of the U.S. state. Like it's not. There's no sovereignty. South Korea doesn't have any sovereignty over what? Over a war with North Korea, which it would lose in literally minutes because North Korea has immense firepower that it doesn't. Like so. These I would say to people who are looking at the destruction of Gaza and looking at the relatively intact state of the Zionist entity and trying to square that circle when they hear, oh yeah, this is a victory for the resistance. You say, how is this a victory? What is this? Is that you have to understand that this is not that they were never going to be able to inflict and like they were never going to when you make a move like October 7th, you're going to get hit hard back. Did the Palestinian resistance know they were going to get genocided? I believe that they did, and the fact that they prepared for it, obviously they had some sort of preparations. Or the other theory is that Egyptians are still running tunnels into the country from under Rafah, that even though the Israelis were there, they're gone now. Actually, they're not gone there. They're still in the quarter. They're still in the Philadelphia quarter for now, but they won't stay. And that was also something that they said they were going to do. So, is a winner when you're a winner and you say, "Oh, I'm doing the following things," and you don't do those things, are you really a winner, or are you somebody who didn't win, aka you lost?
Well, I think there are a few ways we have to look at what the genocide meant, right? I think you're very right to point out that that was the alternative of how to deal with loss. Okay, they suffered a massive loss on October 7th. Um, the first point to make about it is what was unanticipated, perhaps by many, was how uh, how much impunity Israel would have. That it would be able. I think many people thought it could be over very quickly. Um, but what was astonishing was both how the resistance managed to survive, but also that their ability to keep outlasting the attempts to either expel them from the territory or genocide them out of existence, or to make life so intolerable that Palestinians would just leave themselves, that that could go on for so long without external powers intervening effectively, including in the West. Because if you recall, like in previous cases, the United States has stepped in when it appeared that this might spin out of control, or to save Israel from itself, right? I mean, and that didn't really happen uh, for such a long period of time until the ceasefire was called and declared. Um, so, in part, I think one other component to recognize here is the demonstration effect, to try and establish so much pain that there would be deterrence again because they'd lost the deterrence. And in order to reestablish that, in order to reestablish or attempt to reestablish the myth of Zionist military capability, you had to really try and show the world, what was possible in terms of unleashing violence. But in doing so, it also unmasked, Israel as a genocidal state, right? So there were these all these kind of contradictions that were created by the conditions of suffering that massive major military defeat. But I think it was also to communicate to its own public, because the public felt that they had lost a sense of security. And if you think about what was devastated, it was really that sense of security in their own territory, which is why nobody is returning, even with the ceasefire in the north and the ceasefire in the south. Israelis are not returning to their former settlements because they don't believe that the state is capable of protecting them, because that's what's been proven over the course of this time.
Well, and they're correct.
And they're absolutely correct about that. But it was so, in some sense, that has never been reestablished. So, what was accomplished? This is interesting, it seems, to really think about. which is when you see that public opinion is not really in favor of the ceasefire. Like people are very upset with it because it demonstrates that uh, the military goals weren't achieved. Uh, what was achieved was a vengeful kind of display of Palestinian pain and suffering that brought them some kind of compensatory feeling in response to the deep insecurity that was proven, about the actual military and political situation. Um, so I think that's very important to recognize that the kind of broad political and social psychology of the domestic audience was we have to see Palestinians suffering. And they took an extreme amount of enjoyment in that. And that is also why we saw so many, why we have so much evidence of war crimes, of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, and weird perversions of like the Israeli soldiers is because they needed to display to themselves and to people back home that Palestinians are suffering pain and that we can devastate them. So that's what they demonstrated is that we can kill civilians, we can kill women and children, we can brutalize them, we can torment and torture them, but this is what's so important about, from my perspective, the resistance is that forget about the actual fighters. The Palestinian people and the society resisted also by simply maintaining their dignity, their resilience, their faith, their unwillingness to turn upon the resistance. This is what they attempted early on was the political goal was lots of discussion about the so-called day after, which they were anticipating coming very soon, which was that the people will turn upon Hamas because we're subjecting them to so much pain, the Dahia doctrine, that they will, not accept it and be willing to accept some thugs that we will pick for them, or, parachute in some PA,
Or some gangsters that
commanders.
we favor and
Yeah,
protect.
yeah, exactly. This is what, tribal leaders, so called, basically, gangsters and, black marketeers and so on, who have been operating during this period of time, which is why sometimes the aid, what little aid actually made it, was often commandeered and appropriated by many of these gangs who would then sell it at extreme, rates and make the poor people of Gaza suffer even more while they profited from it, this kind of corruption. These were the kinds of people they planned to put in charge of Gaza and to replace Hamas, but they required, the people, the Palestinian people, to be unwilling to accept these conditions that they were suffering and turn upon the resistance, which they did not do. And that, to my mind, is what is really, really disturbing for the Zionists. Why they don't want anyone in Israel to see joyful, kind of celebration by the Palestinians, because what that does is it proves that they are willing to sacrifice to support the resistance, and they will not turn on the resistance. So that's, as we were saying, war is politics by other means. The political goal was to remove the legitimate authority within Palestinian society of Hamas and thus undermine the legitimacy of resistance. And instead, what has happened is actually Hamas, because of the brutality of Israel's bombardment and genocidal assault, has been strengthened politically, you might say, as a consequence. They have emerged at the end of this 15 months in a stronger political position than they were at the start of it, which is really quite amazing if you think about it. That it just completely overturns the logics by which the Zionists assumed politics should, exist. So of course, they may look and say, "You call this a victory?" The rubble, destruction, but they know deep down inside it is a victory because they were not able to break the will of the people, and that even more than the military accomplishments of Palestinian resistance fighters is, to me, very impressive about what has been proven over this last 15 months.
Yeah, I mean, this was those videos, those Qassam videos, and the resistance videos in general. I mean, that those will be with us forever. Like these accomplishments of dudes like in sandals fighting off like a nuclear armed super like power, like she's like a delivery boy for a larger superpower. Like this is not something like this is some historic shit. And part of the sadism, I think, of these Zionist colonial troops is to help obfuscate that, is to help erase that. I mean, if you think about it from on October 7th itself, they they potentially could have had thousands of captives, like over 1,000, because they were taking people back with them, right? Like they were taking captives back with them. Anyone, and there was also non-Palestinians. There was Palestinians, but there were civilians themselves who went into the 48 territories and looked inside, and some of them brought their own captives back. And that's part of the story here, is that this became a commando operation. It then involved the people of Gaza and brought at least some of them and brought them, and this chaos that this caused. And in the chaos of all this, the Israelis used it to kill thousands of their own people, possibly. Like most of the dead on October 7th, the Zionist dead, were the result of the so-called Hannibal doctrine. Right? Zionists killed their own people in order to avoid having to deal with their enemy having leverage over them. They bury the cars right away in this mass burial because it's something, they come up with some stupid fake religious pretext. I mean, come on, they killed their own people in huge numbers by the hundreds, and then they use their immense media power to begin a massive global psyop that is still running to this day. Okay, that helped pave the way and help like stoke the flames of a genocide. I mean, this is some diabolical shit. And then the West is where that media power sits. They don't have media power sitting in fucking Tel Aviv. They use that media power here. It's the Western corporations that they have their fucking fingers deep inside of, as if they need to have their fingers inside of them, because that's like what they're already primed to do. I guess there was the people keep saying over and over again, oh, the resistance miscalculated, resistance miscalculated, making the same mistake that I just pointed out. I just said that, oh, that they won't keep going. Clearly, some part of them did. Part of them they did calculate for that, unless they were able to resupply, which I doubt, because this was part of the plan. I mean, there were stories of. I remember one story of fighters getting cut off. Maybe their tunnels were broken up or something, that they only had a certain amount of food and they lived on, I think, one date per day. Like two dudes living on one date per day. I mean, this is like, we don't get these stories because we live in the West, but this is stuff that will be percolating for Palestinians for generations. This will be a lore, that the Gaza Holocaust and like the Al Aqsa flood will be something that, you know, this will be living with us forever. And that, I don't know, that to me is like, no one's gonna look back. What did they call their operation even? Does anyone even know what their operation is called? I forget. Like whatever their response was, it will only be remembered for its for its tenor, and that will be a stain forever that the people who helped wage this will have to chase. Like we're gonna have to spend the rest of our lives finding people who helped make this happen and holding them accountable in legal ways, obviously, but chasing them down, shaming them, all kinds of different things, from the lowest scum loser mid-level city official to, you know, oligarchs who helped sell this. I mean, Elon himself, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, at the end of all this, he goes and does a Hitler salute. So crazy.
We should probably then consider what some of the consequences are, both in the region and, I would say, on the solidarity community and the politics in the imperial core. Because one point to be made is it is the Palestinian resistance that brought us to this situation. As much as people want to say that the change in presidential administration, is responsible and to shift the focus, the conditions required that something be done, uh, you it's all based on the fact that the Palestinian resistance managed to survive, continue to be effective, and make Israel pay a price militarily, for attempting to control, the Gaza Strip, right? So I don't want to get into that kind of component, but for the pro-Palestine solidarity, I think one is we lost. If it took 15 months, for this to be achieved, it's because there wasn't really an effective intervention or a change of the political situation or adequate pressure. I don't know if there could be. I mean, we
That's
don't
a
know.
question.
That's a question. I mean, could there have been? But the point is that whatever was attempted did not successfully change the political situation. I mean, there's many things that have been positive for the pro-Palestine solidarity movement that people are more aware. There's definitely a lot more sympathy. The overt expressions of political protest were impressive, but it just has unmasked in the way that uh, international law, international humanitarian law, the genocide conventions, all of these things have been unmasked as fictions of the empire to be dispensed with. But now it can't really rely effectively on convincing people that some liberal international order actually exists. No one is convinced. Likewise, domestically, in terms of politics, it's obvious and evident. There was a YouGov poll, that recently was published that demonstrated that um, the Gaza genocide was a significant political factor in the U.S. presidential election. And clearly, they could have known and understood that. The Democrats, Biden regime, the Harris campaign, they understood that there were political costs to maintaining absolute and unquestioned support for genocide in full view of the entire world, both internationally and domestically. But they were willing to do it anyway. They were willing to ignore the majority of people who expressed a desire for a ceasefire. So, what it has unmasked is the nature of our so called democracy domestically in terms of politics. But going forward, I think it's going to be very important to develop and not think that the ceasefire is the end of our political engagement and activity. There still is the possibility of more effective forms of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Especially at this moment, I think we have to take a hard look as a movement of where our efforts can be most effective in solidarity with Palestine, um, and try and establish and conserve some of the political gains that have been made by the heroic resistance of Palestinians for their cause. So that's, I think, going to be an important kind of question going forward is where does the movement go? Does it demobilize because there's been a ceasefire if it lasts for a period of time, or is successfully pushed out of the media spotlight, which actually, frankly, happened many months ago. Actually, there has not been much, um, uh, coverage of the issue until now that there's some ceasefire to talk about and to talk about, whether this is an accomplishment of Trump and what it means and all of that. So suddenly the media is interested in the issue again, but they'd been ignoring it for a while. Uh, but the movement also had kind of slowed in terms of, really innovating new ways to try and put political pressure and maintain the focus on Gaza. And part of it, of course, is what happened a month or so ago. We had a discussion about the first ceasefire and its consequences that immediately led to a new front opening up in Syria. And so that's something I want to talk about also is the consequences going forward in the region. And if that pattern continues, is it now going to be focus on, the Lebanese front because the ceasefire there is actually coming to an end shortly in a few days? It will be the end of the period that had been negotiated for
Four
a
days.
ceasefire. Yeah, in 4 days from time of recording. Whether all attention will be on Yemen, which proved to be the most robust, active community, continuing to interdict Israeli shipping in the Red Sea, continuing to unveil armaments capable of targeting sites military sites, civilian infrastructure in Israel? Um, is there going to be a real focus on Yemen and Ansar Allah, or is this a prelude to putting political and military pressure on Iran? Right. So these are kinds of questions about what does the Gaza situation, if it quiets down because of the ceasefire that may hold.
Not according to Trump.
Well, that's it. I mean, this
The
is
guy himself said it. Yeah. That was the thing what I opened with, is that there's so many tiers to this conversation, which is, are we even in a real ceasefire? I mean, we are right now, but in the sense that the way people are treating this, which is like could be permanent. I mean, first of all, the problem that Palestinians and the resistance have is that the same problem that indigenous people around the world have, which is settlers lie. The agreements that settlers make with indigenous people are easily broken by settlers, and they have a historic pattern of breaking them, and not just in Palestine but across the planet. And so this is a structuring problem of settler colonial and sort of indigenous conflict, is that on the one, you have to force the settler colonial power to behave, as they like to say to us, is that they're the ones who misbehave all the time, who break all kinds of agreements and whatever, which is why I thought the Lebanon thing was just fake. It was a withdrawal, and they're going to keep doing a lot of violence to South Lebanon, which is like their dream. But at the end of the day, they still
more territory
after, which they won't hold, which they won't. If they couldn't hold it in Gaza, they can't hold it in Lebanon, right? And like, this is a problem, and you have to. This is the brass tacks of all this, is that the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict. It doesn't exist. This is a regional, colonial, 100-year-long struggle that you can time. You can, I don't know if you want to bookend it, how you want to bookend it, but essentially, sometime in the 19th century, maybe late 19th century, imperialists realized that there was immense amount of oil wealth, that oil was going to play a huge role in the coming century.
Well, even before that, one could say, well, no, even before the discovery of oil,
right,
even in the
course,
era of steam power, they had designs upon it because of the strategic region connecting to the Indian Ocean via the Red Sea since the Crusades, exactly, as we've talked about before.
But I guess in our phase of it, which is the Zionist phase, which is like where the modern European powers that took shape in, I don't know, 16th, 17th century, that then congealed into imperial, like sort of world spanning global imperial powers in the 18th and 19th, set their sights on this region, on the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. And I guess we can sort of, that's my kind of like bookend here. I said this is a civilizational, global, like imperial war that draws in all of the European powers, sometimes working against each other. Well, at first working against each other, and then beginning in after World War II or World War One, really, to work in concert, except for Germany. But then, this is a regional war. That this war then spans out into all these different fronts. Syria front was one of them, and that unfolded over the course of 60 years. The Syrian Arab Republic never experienced a moment of life not in a war with its most nuclear-armed enemy, backed by another nuclear-armed enemy, and all the European nuclear armament. The Syrian government never enjoyed one day of peace. The Syrian, and the next one won't either. But of course, they're being run by Zionists. That doesn't even matter. But same thing with the in terms of the other regional wars too. Then you have not just the wars being subcontracted to compradors, right? Jordanians, who else? Jordanians, I guess to some degree Lebanese, that these powers, the Gulf powers, right? Like, these are putting their local populations in check to make sure that the regional sort of powers that be aren't disrupted, that everybody works toward the same goal. And the fact that, quite frankly, like Jordanians, Egyptians, like, these people are not allowed to show solidarity with Palestine. Right? They are hounded by an internal police. Forget the Palestinians themselves living in a place like the West Bank, who have to face tens of thousands of armed to the hilt with American weapons of Palestinian security forces. Right? And so, like, this violence of this Zionist project, which is like the main sort of sphere, the tip of the sphere of this sort of Western imperialist project, this thing is a monster. This is a hydra. right? That has so many different powers, that it wages war against the region, that has, subcontracting air, that has powers, that it has the ability to subcontract its powers to Arabs themselves to then do their dirty work. Like this is like, you can't even, I guess I sometimes can't even fathom the scale of this. That like this is 100 years old. Like this fight against this Zionist entity that you try, like Izzedim Al Qassam is like, what, he's dead in 100 years ago, coming up, right? That like this guy decides that, oh yeah, I'm gonna like fight this, and to this day they're still using weapons and his name in this fight. Like we said this in the first version of this, and I guess this might go towards the ending, which is that like 100 years ago there was this guy Izzedim Qassam, and then 70 years later there's this guy Ahmed Yassin, and like we're sitting here now, and like there are like Zionist troops sitting in hospitals right now, like moaning over their blown off legs, like having one leg on one limb, and they were blown apart by an armament named Yassin, fought by, like sent to them, fired by a dude like named like Muhammad or something, fighting for like a brigade called Qassam. That they still, after 100 years, still don't have the ability to squish these like Islamic enemies of theirs, like bugs, which is what they see them as, like vermin. They still don't have the power to make these problems go away in a place like Gaza, which has been subjected to such violence for decades, which is itself a product of violence, which is like all these indigenous people being kettled into this constant, essentially a prison camp, an open air prison camp, what people say, which is a term we shouldn't use, because really they kicked out the colonizer and liberated Gaza, and the war that they had just experienced is the cost of liberation. And that's really the question for me here. The question I would like to end with, and maybe people can comment and get your algorithm going, uh, is that what if this proves to be the end of the siege on Gaza, whatever happens from now, if this goes, let's say the best case scenario, what I could see being the best case scenario is that the Israelis realize that the siege on Gaza is too expensive to maintain, that they can't maintain it, and they have to simply accept a free and independent Gaza. Then this was a war of independence. If that is the case, if it returns to the stalemate of before, where you have it being besieged on all sides in the ocean, I guess that's a question. That's a question I have. Is that what happens to the Yemeni blockade? There seems to be some debate around. Yemenis have said that they are still going to hit Israeli ships in the Red Sea, but they're calling off their operations. I don't know if they mean Israeli linked ships. I don't know if they mean Israeli owned ships. I don't know if they mean trips, if it means good, like ships going to Israel. I don't know. I guess we should check the port traffic at Aliyat and see what it looks like. But that for me is something that,
Yeah, those are good questions. And I mean, I think part of this is going to be really a question about whether there will be solidarity, right? I mean, there is solidarity from Ansarullah. They have demonstrated steadfastness throughout this and the willingness to pay a very heavy price and sacrifice. They're continuing to do so to the extent that they want to make sure that there is, in fact, actually a commitment beyond the first phase, right, of a very temporary, short period of time where there might be some exchange of prisoners and so on, but then continued war making once. Conditions have improved a little bit, both politically and militarily for Israel. So they're doing their part to try and ensure that phases 2 and 3, there will be some cost to abandoning phases 2 and 3, but that's just going to make them a target during a period where maybe other fronts will be quiet, and that is a real kind of question. Will they be subjected to a much more full and organized attempt to, but even if they do, they've already faced this before, during the Saudi war, which was a US Saudi war, and so on. But I think the real question is the solidarity. Do all of these Gulf states and neighboring countries just want to go back to pursuing an Abraham Accords option and creating the fiction that there's some kind of political resolution? Has the October, 7th, Al-Aqsa flood and subsequent 15 months of genocidal assault changed the calculus about what's possible. Can they just go right into normalization, or is there now too high of a cost, to doing so? These are kind of like, I think, going to be real questions. And, reminds me of Ghassan Kanafani's sort of analysis of the situation that, of course, Palestinians are facing the Zionist enemy, but you also have the reactionary Arab regimes that are comprador regimes that have made their peace with the imperial project, which is why they even exist in the shape that they do, which is to control the resources by a small minority, to circulate that wealth in ways that are not going to be on behalf of the vast populations and their social and economic development. It's an attempt to make sure that you buy off a portion of the regional population to be collaborators in imperial control and hegemony. And that is a struggle that has been going on. It is a regional struggle, which is why I think we come back to the conclusion statement that I made in one of our videos before, which is that the decolonization of Palestine is the liberation of the region, and it doesn't work the other way. But there is clearly an interaction between those overlapping levels geographically. They're deeply and intimately, interconnected, and so the politics of that playing out is going to be, I think, the key question and the key component, going forward. Um, so anyway, there's a lot to think about. We'll be watching and looking forward to developments, and observing, what happens and what the real consequences are going to be. Also, under an unpredictable, head of the empire. That's the one thing about Trump, is just that he's a little less predictable, I think, for people in terms of his inclinations and his instincts. But there's no doubt he's head of the empire. Uh, but he might handle and manage it in a very different way. So that's going to be interesting to see whether that has any consequences on the politics of the region going forward. But I want to thank you, Sina, for rapping with me about this. And this is one of the things that we're doing to launch the channel, is to talk about what's going on in the Middle East. But there's so much more that will be coming on this channel related to history, religion, and global affairs broadly. So do stay tuned, and we'll talk again soon.